The night I walked away from my fortune wasn't because I hated money. It was because money made everyone around me a liar. I sat in the back of a sleek black car, one of a dozen in my garage, staring out at the glowing city that stretched like a jeweled net across the horizon. It was strange how beautiful the lights looked when you try to forget they represented deals, inheritances, and a name that never truly belonged to you. Vaughn. The word carried weight, a curse disguised as privilege. My father's empire, my family's legacy, my prison. Hi everyone, I beg you to please subscribe to my channel to help me grow. Please subscribe before we continue the story. Please subscribe, my friends. Now, let's continue our story. I had grown used to the fake smiles at business dinners, the sly touches from women who only cared about their reflection in my wealth, the endless string of handshakes that felt more like contracts than connections. Sometimes I wondered if anyone had ever looked at me, really me, and not seen a dollar sign hovering above my head. That thought had gnawed at me for years, but tonight, something inside me finally snapped. I was done being Sterling Vaughn, the billionaire heir. I want to be just Sterling. No heirs, no fortune, no mask made of money. I made the decision in silence, my driver glancing at me through the rearview mirror, probably sensing the storm beneath my calm. Take me home, I said, though the word home felt hollow. What did it mean, really? The glass-walled retreat at the top of the city was more like a museum than a place to live. The furniture was designer, the rugs hand-woven, the wine collection worth more than some people's entire existence. Yet none of it belonged to me. I never chose any of it. Wealth chooses for you. It wraps you in velvet and suffocates you all the same. When I entered, the place was silent except for the faint hum of the air system. My shoes echoed against the veined stone floor, sharp and lonely. The walls were lined with art chosen by curators, not by my heart. I couldn't even remember the last time I picked something out simply because it made me feel something. I stood in the middle of the sky loft, hands in my pockets, staring at the suspended glass sculpture that poured golden light over the room. Everyone who visited always gasped at it. I hated it. To me, it looked like a frozen waterfall. Beautiful, yes, but lifeless, unchanging. Just like me. I poured myself a drink, not from the rare vintages, but from the simplest bottle I could find, and sat on the edge of the leather sofa. My phone buzzed endlessly. Invitations, reminders, the world pulling me back into its claws. I turned it off. The silence was louder than any party I had ever attended. My chest ached with the weight of it. That was when the idea first rooted itself in my mind. I didn't have to live like this. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not anymore. I could disappear, not from the world, but from the Vaughn name. I had the resources to vanish cleanly, but I didn't want to vanish into some paradise villa or another glittering corner of excess. No, I wanted to blend in. I wanted to live where no one bowed, no one whispered, no one expected. I want to look a woman in the eyes and know she saw me, not my net worth. And to do that, I needed to shed every trace of Sterling Vaughn, billionaire heir. It wasn't as difficult as people might think. Money builds cages, but it also leaves open doors if you know how to walk through them. The next morning, I went to the garage, bypassing the luxury fleet that gleamed like trophies. I picked an older car, one I had kept from my college years, when anonymity was still possible. It wasn't flashy, just a plain sedan with a faint scratch on the door. Perfect. I drove myself for once, the city opening before me in a way it never had when I was chauffeured around like fragile glass. I drove past neighborhoods I had only ever seen from boardroom statistics. Streets lined with corner stores, kids kicking a ball in cracked pavement, small diners with neon signs buzzing in the windows. Life was here. Real life, messy and loud, not staged for magazines. I felt like a trespasser and yet strangely at home. I pulled over in front of a staffing agency I had noticed in the past, the kind that offered temporary jobs. The idea had struck me in the early hours of the morning. If I wanted to live as ordinary, I needed to earn as ordinary. I stepped inside, greeted by the faint smell of coffee and the shuffle of paperwork. The receptionist, a tired-looking woman with reading glasses, asked for my name. For the first time in my life, I hesitated. I couldn't give her that name. Vaughn carried weight even here. Sterling Locke, I said finally, the surname plucked from an old childhood storybook. She nodded, typing it in without so much as a glance up. The relief that washed over me was ridiculous. To her, I wasn't a billionaire. I wasn't anyone. Just another man looking for work. By the end of the hour, I had signed up for a job as a driver. Ironic, maybe, given I'd been driven around all my life. But that was the beauty of it. The disguise wasn't perfect, but it was simple. No one would think to look for the Vaughn heir behind the wheel of a plain sedan. I left the office with papers in hand, a faint smile tugging at my lips. For the first time in years, I wasn't trapped in a fortune. I was free, hidden in plain sight. What I didn't know was that freedom would come with a price. Because somewhere in this city, a woman was about to step into my car and unknowingly step into my life. A woman who would test every boundary between truth and lies. And though I had set this trap for the world, I was the one who would soon discover what it meant to be truly trapped in a billionaire disguise. The first week behind the wheel was an adjustment, but strangely enough, it felt more like breathing than any boardroom I had ever sat in. I wore simple clothes, nothing tailored, just shirts I picked up from a small shop where no one cared who I was. My hands, used to signing contracts and swirling glasses of vintage wine, now gripped a steering wheel for hours at a time. I thought I'd hate it. Instead, I found peace in it. The hum of the road beneath me, the quiet of waiting between pickups, the chance to observe people without being observed myself. I became invisible, and for once, I didn't mind. It was on a Thursday morning, when the sky was heavy with gray clouds and the air smelled like it was about to rain, that everything began to change. I had parked near a small cafe, sipping bitter coffee from a paper cup when the dispatcher sent me a job. Pick up on 5th and Hillcrest, a passenger heading across town. Nothing unusual. I drove the sedan through streets slick with drizzle, windshield wipers swiping rhythmically. While I pulled up to the curb, she was there. Maris Keene. Of course, I didn't know her name then. All I saw was a woman huddled under a thin umbrella, her hair damp from the misty rain. She wasn't dressed like the women I had grown used to in my old world. No designer heels, no expensive perfume clinging to her coat. Instead, she wore a simple navy sweater and black jeans, practical shoes that had clearly seen many days of rushing between jobs. She looked tired but not defeated. Her eyes carried a quiet determination that struck me even before she opened the car door. "Sterling Locke?" she asked, glancing down at the name on her phone. Her voice was low, careful, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had learned not to waste words. "That's me," I said, keeping my tone casual as she slid into the back seat. Her umbrella dripped against the floor mat, and she apologized softly for the mess, even though I didn't care. People like her always apologize for taking up space, while people in my world never even noticed the space they consumed. The address she gave me was across the city, near the industrial district. "Work," she said when I asked, though she didn't offer details. I didn't press. Silence filled the car, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, I found myself glancing at her through the mirror, noticing the way her gaze stayed fixed on the window, like she was lost in thoughts she'd never dare say aloud. Halfway through the drive, the rain thickened, tapping against the roof in steady bursts. I reached for the wipers again, and she finally spoke. "Do you like this job?" The question startled me. Most passengers never asked, or if they did, it was just small talk they forgot before the ride ended. But she looked at me in the mirror, waiting for a real answer. "It's quiet," I said honestly, "and it gives me time to think." Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "That sounds peaceful." She looked out the window again, and after a pause, added, "Better than mine." There was no bitterness in her tone, just truth. And something about that truth pulled at me. She didn't try to impress me, didn't soften her reality into something shinier. She simply was, and she let me see it. I realized then how rare that was. When I dropped her off, she gave me a polite thank you and disappeared into a plain brick building that looked like it had once been a warehouse. I sat there for a moment, staring at the closed door, wondering why a stranger's presence had left the air in the car feeling different, heavier, almost electric. Over the next week, I saw her again, and again, always booking rides through the same service, always tired but steady, always apologizing for dripping umbrellas, for spilled coffee, for being late to the car. She didn't know it, but those small glimpses into her life became the brightest parts of mine. One evening, she slid into the back seat after a long shift, and I noticed the redness around her eyes. She tried to hide it, staring down at her phone, but her silence was heavier than usual. I wanted to ask what was wrong, but I bit back the question. Instead, I adjusted the heat slightly, letting the warm air wrap around her. A few minutes later, she whispered, almost to herself, "It's just one thing after another." I said nothing, but when her eyes met mine in the mirror, I gave a small nod. That was all. No forced advice, no hollow comfort. Just acknowledgement. And for some reason, that seemed to matter. She leaned back, exhaling softly, like the weight on her shoulders had eased a fraction. The more I drove her, the more I wanted to know. Not in the way of an employer gathering information, but as a man curious about a woman who felt real in a world where everything was staged. I began to look forward to her rides, to the quiet conversations that slowly unfolded between us. She told me about her younger brother, about her mother's health struggles, about the dreams she still held onto even when life pressed hard against her. I told her little about myself. Only fragments, carefully chosen, never lies, but never the full truth. And with every ride, every exchange, every glance through the mirror, I felt the walls of my disguise shifting. Because what began as an escape from wealth was becoming something else entirely. It was becoming a tether, pulling me closer to someone who had no idea who I really was. The days blurred together, each one marked by the hum of the engine, the pulse of traffic lights, and the moments Maris slid into the back seat. What began as chance rides soon became a rhythm I could not ignore. I told myself it was coincidence, that she simply used the service often, but deep down I knew I was waiting for her name to appear on the dispatch. Every time it did, a strange anticipation threaded through me, something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just her presence. It was the way she carried herself, as though the weight of the world pressed on her shoulders, and yet she refused to crumble beneath it. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled in sharp slants through the windshield, she climbed into the car carrying a canvas tote, its straps stretched thin from use. She looked tired, hair pinned back in a loose knot, but her eyes flickered with determination. "Library," she said simply, giving me the address. When we arrived, she hesitated before stepping out. Then she leaned forward, gripping the back of my seat lightly. "Do you read?" she asked, her voice carrying the same tentative curiosity as when she'd asked about my job. I blinked, startled by the question. Most people assumed drivers lived invisible lives, mute bodies behind the wheel. But she didn't. She looked at me as if I were more than just a service. I admitted. Not as much lately. "You should start again." She gave a faint smile, pushing the door open. "Books don't judge. They just wait." Her words lingered with me long after she disappeared inside the library's heavy glass doors. That night, for the first time in months, I pulled out an old book from my apartment shelf, a battered copy of Steinbeck I'd nearly forgotten. Her voice echoed in my head as I read, and I wondered why a stranger's opinion mattered so much. Our exchanges grew. Some days she was quiet, lost in her thoughts. Other days she would speak, not about glamorous things, but about the realities of her life, the double shifts at work, the medical bills piling up for her mother, the endless pressure to keep going when everything seemed stacked against her. She spoke plainly, without self-pity, and I found myself listening more intently than I had ever listened to anyone in boardrooms or high society parties. One evening, as twilight spread lavender across the sky, she sat in the back seat holding a takeout bag that smelled faintly of garlic. "Do you ever get tired of people pretending?" she asked suddenly. The question struck me like a blade. "All the time," I replied before I could stop myself. She tilted her head, studying me. "I knew it. You don't talk like the other drivers." Panic flickered in my chest. Had I slipped? Was my mask cracking? But she only smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Don't worry. That's not a bad thing." Her trust unsettled me. She trusted easily, or maybe she chose to believe in people even when she had every reason not to. That kind of faith was dangerous. Dangerous for her, dangerous for me. And yet, I couldn't pull away. One Friday night, after I'd driven her across town from another exhausting shift, she lingered before leaving the car. "You know," she said softly, "I think you might be the only person I can talk to without pretending." Her confession cut through me, because it was the same truth I carried. She didn't know she was speaking to the biggest pretender of them all. That night, I lay awake in the small apartment I had chosen for my disguise. The ceiling was plain, unadorned, a far cry from the vaulted ceilings I once knew, but for the first time, I didn't miss them. All I could think about was her voice, her laugh, the quiet strength in her eyes. And I wondered how long I could keep this secret without destroying the very connection I was beginning to crave. The disguise had given me freedom, but now it was chaining me in another way. Because the more time I spent with Maris Keene, the harder it became to remember why I had ever wanted to disappear in the first place. Her laughter caught me off guard the first time I heard it. It wasn't the polished, restrained kind I was used to, the kind that floated across ballroom floors like a rehearsed melody. No, hers was unpolished, full-bodied, the kind that tumbled out before she had time to stop it. It happened on a Saturday afternoon when she booked a ride to the community center where she volunteered. "You volunteer on top of everything else?" I asked as I drove, glancing at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She shrugged. "It's just a few hours a week. Helps me remember life isn't only about bills and broken things." "What do you do there?" "Tutoring," she said simply. "Kids who've fallen behind in school. Some of them just need someone to sit still with them for an hour." She paused, then added with a small smirk, "You'd be surprised how far multiplication tables can go in building confidence." I chuckled, and she blinked in surprise before breaking into that unguarded laugh. It filled the car, warm and bright, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir in my chest. Something alive, something dangerous. That evening, after I dropped her off, I drove aimlessly around the city. I couldn't shake the sound of her laugh, the way it clung to the silence long after she was gone. I told myself it was foolish, that I was treading on dangerous ground. But telling myself and believing it were two different things. The nights grew colder, and with them came more rides. She began to sit closer to the front, not in the back like most passengers. Sometimes she'd talk about her day, other times she'd fall quiet, content just to sit in shared silence. Those silences didn't feel empty. They felt like something building, something unsaid. One evening, as the city lights flickered like restless stars outside the windshield, she asked me a question that stopped my breath. "Do you ever feel like you're living two lives at once?" The irony nearly made me laugh. If only she knew. "Every day," I answered softly. She looked at me then, really looked, her gaze steady and searching. For a moment, I thought she could see through me, peel back the layers of disguise and glimpse the truth I had hidden so carefully. My chest tightened with both fear and longing. From then on, the air between us shifted. It wasn't just rides anymore. It was conversations that spilled deeper, small moments that lingered. A brush of her hand as she passed me a cup of coffee she'd brought one morning. The way her eyes softened when she found me waiting outside the building after a late shift. The warmth of her presence in the passenger seat when the world outside was cold and unkind. I began to crave those moments more than I had ever craved success, more than the endless chase for recognition in the world I had left behind. And yet, each time her trust in me deepened, guilt gnawed harder. Because every word I spoke, every smile I returned, was wrapped in a lie I couldn't untangle without breaking what was slowly, inevitably, taking root between us. The night it became undeniable. The city was drenched in rain again. She slid into the front seat, hair damp, cheeks flushed from the chill. I offered her my jacket without thinking, and she hesitated only a second before draping it over her shoulders. The scent of her skin mixed with the faint cologne I had sprayed that morning, and the closeness made my pulse quicken. We didn't speak for most of the ride, but when we reached her stop, she lingered with her hand on the door. "You're different," she whispered, almost as if confessing to herself more than to me. "I don't know why, but I feel like I can breathe around you." She left before I could reply. but her words settled into me like a flame that refused to die. I knew then, this was no longer just an escape. This was no longer just disguise. This was something real, something I couldn't walk away from. And it terrified me as much as it thrilled me, because sooner or later, the truth would come out. And when it did, I wasn't sure if what we were building could survive the weight of it. The first crack in my disguise came quietly, almost too small to notice. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Maris had asked if I could wait for her while she picked something up from her workplace. Normally, I didn't linger for passengers. It wasn't part of the rules, but for her, the rules had stopped mattering long ago. I parked outside the plain brick building and watched her vanish through the double doors. While I waited, my phone buzzed. Not the cheap phone I use for driving, but the one I kept tucked away in the glove box, the one linked to the life I was supposed to have abandoned. Against my better judgment, I checked it. Dozens of unread emails stacked up like accusations. My assistant's messages sat at the top, each more urgent than the last. One subject line chilled me. Urgent, bored, threats escalating. Before I could read further, the passenger door opened and Maris slid back in, shaking the rain from her hair. I shoved the phone back into the glove box, so quickly it thudded against the plastic. She noticed. Her brows arched. Secret stash, she teased lightly, though there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. I forced a laugh. Something like that. She let it go, but I could feel her glance linger on me as I pulled away from the curb. My pulse drummed in my ears, and for the first time, I realized how thin the threads of my disguise had become. The second crack came a few days later. She had left her tote bag in the car by mistake, and when I returned it to her, she insisted on making me coffee in her tiny apartment as thanks. I should have declined. I should have stayed behind the wheel where the boundaries were safer. But I didn't. Her apartment was small, barely enough space for a worn sofa, a crowded bookshelf, and a dining table with one leg propped up by stacked magazines. It felt more alive than any mansion I had ever lived in. The smell of cinnamon and strong coffee filled the air, and the walls were covered in photographs. Her with her brother, her with friends at the community center, her mother smiling faintly from hospital bed. Nothing about the place was extravagant, but every inch of it pulsed with warmth and truth. "You live alone?" I asked, sipping the coffee she handed me. "Yeah, my brother stays sometimes, but he's still in school. Mom's, well, you can guess." She gestured toward one of the photos and then quickly looked away. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My throat tightened as I looked around her world, so full of fight, so full of love, and thought about the empty halls of the Vaughn estate, where wealth echoed but never spoke. "Your turn," she said suddenly, tilting her head. "You know half my life by now. What about yours? Where do you come from, Sterling?" Her eyes were sharp, searching, and for a moment I considered telling her everything. The name, the fortune, the weight of a world she couldn't imagine. But fear clamped down hard. "I move around a lot," I said carefully. "Don't really keep roots." Something flickered in her gaze, doubt, maybe, or disappointment, but she didn't push. Instead, she smiled faintly. "Figures. You don't talk like a man tied down." I stayed too long that evening, sitting on her worn sofa while rain streaked the window glass. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere that had nothing to do with my last name, nothing to do with Vaughn. But when I left, guilt pressed down on me heavier than ever. Because what she saw wasn't me. Not fully. She saw Sterling Locke, the quiet driver, not Sterling Vaughn, the billionaire hiding behind the wheel. The third crack came when we crossed paths outside of her rides. I had been walking through a quiet street market, drawn by the smell of roasted chestnuts, when I spotted her at a vendor's stall. She looked different without the weight of exhaustion clinging to her. Lighter somehow, her laughter easy as she haggled for a better price. For a moment, I just stood there, watching, captivated by how she seemed to bring life to even the simplest corner of the city. When she turned and saw me, her surprise melted into delight. "Sterling, what are you doing here?" I fumbled for an answer, my mind too tangled. "Just walking." She grinned. "Then walk with me." And I did. Through rows of stalls, past lanterns strung between buildings, into a world that wasn't mine, but that I desperately wanted to belong to. She told me stories about her childhood, about saving coins to buy books, about sneaking into abandoned gardens with her brother during summers. And I listened, all the while aching with the knowledge that my own past was buried beneath layers of lies I couldn't share. By the time we parted that evening, her arm brushing mine as she said goodbye, I knew the disguise wasn't just slipping, it was unraveling. And if I didn't find a way to stop it, the truth would tear through both our lives like a storm. It was subtle at first, the way closeness became second nature. She began calling me when she wasn't booking a ride. Small things like asking if I knew a shortcut to beat traffic or if I could pick her up a little earlier so she wouldn't walk home alone after a late shift. Each call was an invitation, each invitation a thread weaving me deeper into her life. And I let it happen. I wanted it to happen. One evening, I drove her to the community center again. The kids swarmed her as soon as she walked in, tugging at her sleeves, chattering over each other to get her attention. I waited outside, leaning against the car, watching through the glass doors. She looked radiant in that moment. Unpolished, hair pulled back in a loose braid, sleeves rolled to her elbows as she crouched to help a little boy sound out a word from his book. There was no spotlight, no applause, no audience of investors or high society friends. And yet she glowed brighter than anyone I had ever known. When she came back to the car, cheeks flushed and eyes shining, she looked almost guilty for keeping me waiting. "Sorry," she murmured, sliding into the passenger seat instead of the back. "You don't have to apologize," I told her. "Not to me." She smiled faintly and turned her face toward the window, but the silence between us wasn't empty. It was thick, humming, alive with something neither of us dared name. Days turned into weeks. One night, she insisted on cooking dinner to thank me for all the rides. I tried to protest, but she rolled her eyes and dragged me upstairs to her apartment anyway. The place smelled like roasted vegetables and thyme, and though she claimed she wasn't much of a cook, the food was simple and perfect. "You're too kind to a stranger," I teased gently, watching her pour water into mismatched glasses. "You're not a stranger anymore," she said without looking at me, her voice quiet but firm. The words landed in my chest like a stone in water, rippling outward until I couldn't breathe. Not a stranger. She didn't know how much I wanted that to be true. After dinner, we sat on the sofa, side by side. The lamp cast a golden glow, and the air felt charged. She leaned back, eyes half closed from exhaustion, and I found myself studying the curve of her cheek, the way her lips parted slightly when she sighed. I shouldn't have lingered, shouldn't have allowed the thought of leaning closer to even exist. But the thought was there, simmering undeniable. "Why do you always look at me like that?" she asked suddenly, eyes opening to catch mine. I froze, caught in the act. "Like what?" "Like I'm more than I am." Her voice was barely a whisper. I swallowed hard. "Maybe you are." The silence that followed was dangerous. Her gaze held mine, steady and unflinching, and I knew if either of us moved even an inch closer, there would be no turning back. She broke the moment by laughing softly, shaking her head. "You say things like that, Sterling, and I don't know what to do with them." Neither did I. The truth was clawing at me more violently now. Every time she opened her door to me, every time she trusted me with another piece of her world, guilt twisted deeper. She thought I was a man of quiet means, someone ordinary, safe. If she knew I was Sterling Vaughn, the man with a fortune built on empires, the man whose face had graced financial magazines, would she still look at me with the same softness? Or would she see me as just another figure who belonged to a world that had already taken too much from her? One night, as I drove her home, she reached for the radio dial, scrolling through static until a song filled the car. She began to hum softly, her voice low and imperfect, but it struck me harder than any concert hall performance. I glanced at her profile, the relaxed tilt of her head, the half-smile on her lips, and I knew, with terrifying certainty, that I was falling for her. Not as a man hiding behind a disguise. As myself, the self I had almost forgotten existed. But falling in love while wearing a mask is the cruelest kind of lie. And with each passing day, the risk of exposure grew sharper. pressing against the fragile bond we had built. Still, I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop, because in the warmth of her laughter, in the quiet strength of her presence, I had found something I thought I'd lost forever. The possibility of being seen, not as a billionaire, not as a Vaughn, but as a man. And I knew I was already in too deep. The night of the charity fundraiser arrived with the kind of inevitability I had tried to outrun for months. I had avoided events like this since shedding my old life, but this one was different. The Vaughn Foundation was hosting my family's foundation, and I had no choice but to appear. If I didn't, the whispers on the board would grow into threats I couldn't ignore. My name, my presence, my signature, all were still required to keep the empire intact. I told myself I could manage it discreetly. Attend, smile, sign papers, and vanish before anyone noticed too closely. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. Maris had mentioned earlier that week that she'd been invited to a charity event by one of her colleagues. She spoke casually about it, almost as if it were just another evening of obligation. I didn't think much of it at the time, until I walked into the marble atrium of the Hallenford Center, dressed in a tailored suit I hadn't worn in months, and saw her. She was across the room, standing uncertainly near the refreshments table, a borrowed dress skimming her frame, her hair falling in loose waves. She looked out of place among the glittering crowd, but to me, she was the most striking person in the room. My heart lurched and then sank, because she was about to see me, not Sterling Locke, the driver she trusted, but Sterling Vaughn, the man on the banners, the heir whose face was etched into the very event she was attending. The announcement came swiftly. A spotlight swept across the room, and the host's voice rang out. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our evening's benefactor, Mr. Sterling Vaughn." Gasps rippled through the guests, cameras lifted, and polite applause filled the air. I stepped forward, each foot heavy as stone, and in the crowd, Maris's eyes locked on me. At first, confusion flickered, then disbelief, and finally betrayal. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The tote bag she always carried slipped slightly from her shoulder as she took a half-step back, like the ground beneath her had shifted. I wanted to run to her, to explain, but the speech was already beginning, and I was trapped at the podium with 100 eyes pinning me in place. The words I spoke were practiced, polished, the kind of speech I had delivered 1,000 times before. But my voice felt foreign, my chest hollow. I couldn't look at the audience, not really. My gaze kept pulling back to Maris, standing frozen among strangers, her face a canvas of disbelief and hurt. When the speech ended and the applause swelled, she was gone. I found her outside, standing in the cold, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The city lights painted her face in fractured gold, but her eyes were sharp, wounded. "So," she said, her voice low, almost trembling, "all this time, you've been him?" "Maris," I started, but she shook her head. "You let me spill my life to you. My worries, my struggles, everything. And all along, you were hiding behind some game. Do you have any idea how cruel that is?" "It wasn't a game," I said quickly, stepping closer. "It started as escape, yes. But then I met you, and—" "Don't," she cut me off, her voice breaking. "Don't say it like it means something. Because whatever this is, it was built on a lie." Her words sliced deeper than I expected. I reached out, desperate, but she flinched back, and that tiny movement hurt more than any rejection I'd ever faced. "Maris, please," I whispered, my throat raw. "I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted to be someone real with you. Not the name, not the money, just me." Her eyes glistened, but she shook her head. "You don't get to choose when you're honest. You don't get to rewrite the truth after you've already taken away my choice to know it." The silence that followed was brutal. The noise of the city hummed around us, car horns and chatter, but it all felt distant. Between us was only the fracture, the jagged wound of betrayal. Finally, she turned, pulling her coat tighter around her, and walked away. I didn't follow. I couldn't, because for the first time since stepping into my disguise, I realized I had lost the one thing I had been searching for all along: trust. And without it, all the money in the world couldn't buy back what had just slipped through my hands. The days after the fundraiser stretched out like years. Every morning, I reached for my phone, half expecting her name to appear, only to be met with silence. I drove aimlessly, accepting rides that blurred together, none of them hers. Her absence weighed heavier than her presence ever had. I had thought the truth would set me free, but instead it had shackled me to a loneliness more piercing than anything I'd felt before. Maris, meanwhile, built walls around herself. She stopped using the service, stopped answering the few cautious texts I dared to send. I imagined her sitting in her small apartment, the photos on the wall watching silently as she tried to stitch her life back together. In her eyes, I wasn't just a liar. I was proof that the world she distrusted could slip into her life and wound her when she least expected it. I couldn't stay away forever. After a week of silence, I drove to the community center, waiting outside until she emerged. She saw me immediately. Her expression shuddered. "You shouldn't be here," she said, walking past me without slowing. I needed to explain. I followed, keeping my distance. Not at a podium, not in front of cameras. Just us. She stopped abruptly, turning to face me. "Explain what? That you pitied me? That it amused you to play at being ordinary, while I poured my soul out to someone who wasn't even real?" "I was real," I insisted, my voice rough. "Every word I said to you, every moment, it wasn't fake. Yes, I hid who I was, but what I felt when I was with you, that was the truest thing I've ever known." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her jaw stayed firm. "You don't get to decide what's true for me, Sterling. You took away my choice to know who you really were. Do you understand that? You controlled the story, and I trusted you because I thought you were safe." Her voice cracked on the last word, and it cut deeper than a blade. I wanted to argue, to tell her that I had been more myself with her than I had ever been with anyone else. But the pain in her eyes silenced me. She didn't need declarations. She needed time, space, proof. Over the next weeks, I tried to show her, quietly, without forcing myself into her world. I donated anonymously to the community center, ensuring the tutoring program wouldn't lose funding. I arranged for her mother's hospital bills to be reduced through connections I hadn't touched in months. I didn't sign my name to any of it. I couldn't risk it looking like more manipulation. But I hoped she would see the ripples, would know somehow that I cared. And still I kept driving. Not because I needed to, but because it was the only way I knew how to hold on to the man I had been when I met her. Behind the wheel, I wasn't Sterling Vaughn the billionaire. I was just a man waiting for a chance to be forgiven. One evening, as I pulled into a quiet street after a long shift, I saw her walking ahead, tote bag heavy on her shoulder. My breath caught. I slowed the car, matching her pace. She turned, startled, and for a moment I thought she'd walk away again. But instead, she stopped. We stood there in the hush of twilight, the city lights flickering in the distance. Her gaze was tired, guarded, but not entirely closed. "Why are you still here?" she asked softly. "Because I can't leave," I said. "Because even if you never forgive me, I'd rather be near your world, even at its edges, than go back to a life that means nothing without you." Her eyes searched mine, as if weighing whether to believe me. At last, she shook her head, whispering, "You make it so hard to hate you." Hope flared, fragile but alive. I didn't move closer. I didn't reach for her. I just let the words hang between us, a thread, delicate and trembling, that might one day lead us back to each other. The slow work of rebuilding something shattered is nothing like the thrill of first discovery. With Maris, it was no longer about grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It became about silence, about patience, about waiting for her to see that I wasn't going to vanish the moment things got hard. Weeks turned into months, and though she didn't welcome me back, she stopped turning me away completely. Sometimes I'd see her at the community center, where I lingered quietly in the back of a fundraiser or a tutoring session. Sometimes we'd pass each other in the street, and though her smile never quite reached her eyes, it was no longer absent altogether. It was a small thaw in the long winter between us. I knew I had to tread carefully. My old life had taught me to fix problems with money, with power, with speed. But Maris was nothing like the boardrooms or headlines I had once commanded. With her, There was no shortcut, no negotiation, no transaction. If I wanted her to see me again, I had to stand still long enough for her trust to regrow on its own terms. One Saturday, I volunteered at the community center, quietly stacking supplies in the storage room. When she walked in, she paused, her brow furrowing. "What are you doing here?" I wiped dust from my hands, offering a faint smile. "Following orders. Mrs. Kellerman said this room needed sorting, and I figure I'm good at carrying boxes." Her lips twitched, just barely. "You? Carrying boxes? Doesn't seem very Vaughn." The way she said my last name carried less venom than it once had. I shrugged. Maybe that's why I like it. Reminds me I'm not just that name. She didn't respond, but she didn't leave either. For the next hour, we worked side by side, the silence not nearly as heavy as it once had been. Later that week, she surprised me. She slid into the back seat of my car while I was waiting near her block, her arms folded. "I needed a ride," she said flatly, though I knew she could have taken a dozen other options. The drive was quiet, the hum of the city filling the space between us. Finally, she spoke. "You know my mother's treatments, the bills, things have been easier lately. Don't think I don't know why." My grip on the wheel tightened. I hadn't wanted her to find out. I wasn't trying to. "I know," she interrupted softly. "That's why I'm not angry about it." Our eyes met in the rearview mirror. There was no forgiveness there yet, but there was something else, an acknowledgement, maybe even gratitude. The months went on like that. Moments stitched together, tentative threads weaving into something fragile, but undeniably real. I never pushed. I never demanded. I just stayed. I became the man who carried boxes, the man who drove her home when she was tired, the man who showed up and didn't leave. And slowly, impossibly, she began to let me back in. Not with declarations, not with sudden warmth, but with the way her shoulders softened when I walked into a room. With the way she no longer avoided my eyes. With the way, one evening as we left the center together, she brushed her hand against mine, not quite holding it, but not pulling away either. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was hope. And for me, that was enough to keep going. It happened on an ordinary evening, one of those dusky hours when the city hummed softly and the air smelled faintly of rain. I had just finished dropping off supplies at the center, lingering longer than I needed to, because any excuse to be near her was one I clung to. Maris was locking up for the night, her tote bag slung over her shoulder, as always. I offered her a ride, and for the first time in months, she said yes without hesitation. The silence in the car was no longer heavy. It was companionable, filled with the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be broken. She leaned her head back against the seat, her eyes closed, the faintest trace of ease softening her features. When we reached her street, I expected her to say goodnight, to walk away as she always did. Instead, she lingered. "Do you want to come in?" she asked softly, almost like she surprised herself by saying it. I swallowed hard, nodding. Her apartment hadn't changed. The tiny mismatched chairs, the peeling paint, the framed photographs of her mother and little brother. It all reminded me of the first time I'd seen her world. Except this time, she didn't keep me at arm's length. She set down her bag, poured us both tea, and sat across from me at the table, her fingers tracing the chipped rim of her mug. "I've been angry," she said finally, her voice low. "Angry at you for lying. Angry at myself for believing so easily. But I've also been tired. Tired of holding that anger. Tired of pushing you away when all you've done since has proved you're not leaving." I sat very still, afraid any word might shatter the fragile honesty between us. She lifted her eyes to mine, steady and searching. I can't pretend it didn't hurt, but I also can't pretend that what we had wasn't real. And lately, she exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping. Lately, I've realized I don't want to live in the hurt anymore. My chest tightened, my pulse thundering. "Maris!" She raised a hand, stopping me gently. "I'm not promising forever. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying I'm willing to try. If you are." The words nearly undid me. Relief, gratitude, love, all tangled inside me until I could barely breathe. I reached across the table, my hand hovering uncertainly until she closed the gap, her fingers slipping into mine. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't the kind of dramatic, cinematic moment my old world thrived on. It was something quieter, steadier, more real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. In the weeks that followed, we didn't rush. We built slowly, brick by brick, honesty layered where secrets had once lived. She let me in, not to rescue her, not to sweep her away, but to walk beside her. And I, for the first time, let someone see all of me. The heir, the driver, the man who had made mistakes and wanted nothing more than to do better. One evening, as we walked home from the center, her hand slipped fully into mine, warm and sure. She glanced at me, a smile tugging at her lips. Trapped in a billionaire disguise, she teased softly. Who would have thought that's how I'd meet the real you? I laughed, the sound light and unguarded. Who would have thought I'd ever find someone worth losing the disguise for? She leaned her head against my shoulder, and in that simple gesture was everything I had ever wanted. Not wealth, not legacy, just love, fragile and fierce, rebuilt from the ruins. And this time it was real,